Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today for a third time on the podcast is Nate Denning. Nate is a physical therapist, sports specialist, strength coach, and he really does a great job with baseball. He's really made a great name for himself in the sport of baseball. And he just recently released an entire course online about periodized program design for baseball. So we kind of talk about what that is today, what it means to periodize a program and why it's essential for a sport, especially baseball. This is an episode that I know you're going to love. This episode and all of our episodes in season 5 are sponsored by Isophit. That's my go-to for all things isometric strength training. And we actually talk a little bit about isometric training for baseball players today and why we love it so much. So I highly recommend you check out Isophit. Enjoy. Nate, welcome back to the podcast, man. I think this is like appearance number 3 or 4 for you. It's always good to have you back on.
Hey, I was actually thinking about that too. I'm pretty sure it's 3. And can't thank you enough for having me on. It's always a fun time.
Yeah, for sure, man. For people who maybe haven't caught your past podcast episodes that we've done, or maybe they just aren't familiar with you and integrated performance, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing things that you do?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if you can call them amazing or not or anything like that, but it's something. So physical therapist, strength coach, by trade. Graduated from Indiana University up in Indianapolis for PT school, and then I did a sports residency down at Evansville with a great group of guys down there. From there, went down to Exos in Pensacola, where we did a whole lot of training with some professional level athletes and a lot of NFL players and different sports, MLB included, and a lot of work with our SOCOM special operations guys. I did that for a few years and then took a position with the Minnesota Twins as a physical therapist and reconditioning specialist, and did that for a year and then decided, hey, I think I'm ready to branch out on my own a little bit and start my own thing back up in Indianapolis, where it's close to where I grew up at. And from there, just kind of trying to work in a baseball facility and train and treat mainly majority baseball players.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And I think you've really made a name for yourself between Exos and your time with the Twins and what you're doing now in the sport of baseball. And I know you recently dropped a course specifically for periodized program design in athletes. And I know you're kind of always thinking through that baseball lens. Would you mind filling us in a little bit about what that is and what you mean by periodized program design?
Yeah. So when you think periodization for any type of like training purposes, you think like a yearly, monthly, weekly, daily scheduling on what you need to be training for, just to make sure that you build the athlete up to their sport, what they're trying to do. So what are they trying to accomplish? So for baseball players, which I kind of specifically talk on there, have a very specific schedule, especially when you talk about a pitcher, as far as they have very intense days, especially a starter, where they go out and throw 70 to 100 plus pitches, and then they have a few days off to recover from that. So in a weekly schedule, for if you talk periodization, that means a weekly up and down trend of high performance and then recovery basis. But then if you extrapolate that out to the year, how do we get that pitcher to perform at the highest level during his season? And that takes a year-long approach, where training may look a little different in January than it does in June or July, especially if they're in season. Say now, if you talk about a professional baseball player, they're in season right now. They just started in April. What does their training look like in October, November, and December and January versus what it looks like now? I kind of talk you through how to alter your training, how to get them to the point where they want to compete at their highest level.
Why is the whole concept of periodization important? You mean to like tell me that I can't just like go off program and try and like rep my bench like max 4 or 5 days a week and call it like lifting and like injury prevention? Or
Yeah. So yeah, if you try to do the same thing from in season to out of season, if you're trying to build, say, like hypertrophy in season, you may end up creating a slower athlete. So off season, so just a little bit of little hints into this, like if you're in off season and you're trying to build and you need a bigger athlete, you can work on slower movements to build muscular strength, but those slower movements counteract that high velocity. They're complete opposites of that higher velocity, higher throw, higher demand throwing, which is very powerful movement. So you may need to train a little bit more power and train the body to move faster during their season so that they get the best quality of training and their body is ready to handle that stress at that time. Otherwise, you may just actually become a detriment, and they learn how to move slow, but they can't transition that moving slow to a fast movement.
I think ultimately it comes back to having a plan for what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. And I feel like this is an area that coaches, PTs, we often struggle with this, is we just kind of start going after stuff and we don't have our like blueprint laid out for where we're going to end up, for lack of a better way to put it. And I think that the art of program design really can help with that, one, and two, really stems from the ability to actually like understand what someone is going to need and how those needs are going to change in response to the stimulus being applied to them. So like in the sport of baseball, for example, what they need changes when they're in season versus out of season.
Yeah, for sure. And then also, what is the athlete presenting to you as too? So does one athlete have a lot of power, but they can't consistently reuse that power in an elastic type energy? Do they need to develop that before they can even get to the season for next year? So kind of the testing, and this is what I kind of talk you through too, as far as like what kind of testing do you do in a performance standpoint, and then how do you prioritize that during off season versus in season during preseason to increase the level of that athlete in the demands that they're lacking.
I think you proposed too, like almost like a hierarchical model to understanding programming design, from like movement to performance to skill. Is that correct?
You have to have the base layer of movement. So that's the foundation of some of the stuff that I walk you through a little bit, as far as like if an athlete is not able to get into position for certain movements, like programming that movement in their weight training is probably detrimental to them. But they can't build the capacity, they can't build the performance on top of that foundation as well as they can to put that into the skill. So you can look at it in a form of, I feel like a squat is very easy to look at and visualize. So if somebody can't body weight squat and we're trying to consistently just bang weight on them and to get them stronger, they're probably not going to get the most benefit from a squat to increase the strength. But then if they can't increase the strength from it because they can't physically hit those positions to get stronger in a squat, how are they going to even be explosive in, say, a broad jump type movement? Because they can't sit down and load into their hips and then explode out of it, because they still can't get into the positions. So stacking that movement and then getting their performance based off of it, and then putting in their skill, which their skill in a broad jump or power movement may look more like going down towards home plate for a pitcher.
Right. It sounds kind of like the quadrant system of exercises that Dan John proposed a few years ago, right? You have to have that general movement sense, or the GPP, covered before you progress into the like fancy advanced stuff. And I think in today's day and age, I feel like a lot of people really try to flip that progression that you just outlined, movement, performance, skill. They try and flip it and go right to skill without any kind of like movement or performance training, or really any kind of like overall achievement in those senses, for lack of a better way to put it, right? Like I think Robert Butler broke it down a while ago, in that we have to progress movement for our athletes kind of like we progress someone through school, right? Like you don't walk into the gym on day one and start hitting hang cleans. And if you do, it's like, well, how about the fact that you can't even hinge properly, right? Like you have to progress to the advanced stuff. You don't just jump in and do it on day one, but everyone wants to focus on the skill stuff, it seems. Everyone wants to kind of dive into, they got to throw 95 miles an hour to get their big league offer. And it's so interesting, because I think the majority of the time we are better served by flipping that and focusing on the general stuff as opposed to the super specific stuff.
Yeah, and some of that stuff, that's the sexy stuff too. So like that's they're Like when you flip it, you're looking for the quick fix a little bit. Like the stuff if you build a foundation, it takes a little bit to build. So because you have to go step by step. If it's a mechanical fix, you'll make changes pretty quick, but that only works for 10 to 15% of the population, because not not everybody has that foundation built. But if they do, and it's a skill fix, then great. Then it's a pretty, not a simple fix, but it's at least an easier fix than somebody that doesn't even have the foundation set. But then building out what their foundation is into a daily activity for programming is where the artwork comes from a little bit too. So you can have foundational lifts to build up power, to build up strength, and then to build up power then afterwards. But if you don't match up what the athlete is doing, how the athlete moves, and you're just throwing a strength movement and then a power movement and then an elastic energy movement, but you're not matching it to what the athlete can do, you're still missing the foundational piece. You think you're doing it foundational from going from one to the next to the other, but you're not matching your programming to what the athlete is showing. You're essentially just trying to match your athlete to your programming.
Right. You match the athlete to the program instead of the program to the athlete. It's flipped, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's why we do the assessments in the first place, is to adapt our programming to them, not make them fit the program.
Absolutely.
And I think, to your point, it's so much more like challenging to try and correct things when someone doesn't have a foundation, because I now kind of have to like go back and undo whatever foundation they had and rebuild it, right? Like think of it like a house. If you build a solid foundation for a house to sit on the first time, it seems to like hold up longer term and not fall
100%.
down. But if you cut corners and make some mistakes, then trying to fix it when the rest of the house is standing is so much more challenging.
100%. It's like you're saying, the foundation, you can make some simple changes, some minor tweaks to something that cracked the wall, like say somebody just punched a hole in the wall. That you can make some minor tweaks in that, and you still have a long-standing house. But a house that's built on a foundation that's not great, you're gonna have to tear it back down just to build it back up.
Yeah.
As opposed to just fixing the minor things.
I completely agree. And it's interesting too, because I like how you broke it down between movement, performance, and then skill. A lot of times I think people mix up the performance and skill. And what I mean by that is like, performance to me is, power output, for example, like vertical jump height. But, in a sport like baseball, that means nothing if it doesn't translate over to what you can do on the field. So I really like the fact that you make the distinction between performance, aka what we do in the weight room, and skill, in that's how it like translates to the field.
Right. And there's always it's always a spectrum. Like there's a fine line that you walk between it. But if it's kind of like we've talked about before, like your performance metrics, if you don't have the strength, if you don't have the power, if you don't have the elastic energy, if you don't have the postural integrity to actually withstand load over a long amount of times, like showing repeatability on the mound is going to be very hard to do. One to produce power, to produce velo, if you don't have power in a say like a medicine ball scoop toss, if you can't produce power to throw that hard and quick, then it's going to be very hard to transfer that skill down the mound. But then if you don't have the endurance, just your metabolically cardiovascular, it's going to be hard to sustain high velocity throughout multiple innings, because you just don't have the capacity for your body to withstand that.
Yeah, it's the difference between throwing 100 miles an hour once and throwing it every time you throw a fastball.
Right. The recovery has to be there within a short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me think back to, I think we've talked before as well, not just the focus on repeatability from the skill, but almost like the repeatability from the program as well, in the sense of like your programming has to produce results over time, and those results have to stick, and you have to be able to reproduce those results in order for it to be effective, right? Like programming and programming design is not just us trying to swing for the fences, hit our 600-foot home run, and then retire and hang up the jersey. Like we're trying to do that every single time we step up to bat here. And I think
Yeah,
that
and
that's
then
something that a lot of people forget, or a lot of coaches, really hang their hat on, this one specific case. Hey, I had this athlete once and they jumped a 40-inch vertical. That's great.
yeah,
But, maybe it was a genetically gifted athlete. Maybe they grew up with like, a real strong jumping background and had some other influences, and no one else on your program has ever done that. To me, that's not as impressive as a program that consistently gets someone there.
yeah. And then what are your standards that you're talking about? Like how do you know that you're making somebody better too? Do you simply just say, hey, this athlete just went from high school to college to pro, so so his programming must be good? Or do you actually have standards of like, hey, are you testing broad jump, vertical jump, triple broad jump? What's their strength numbers? What are your criteria that you're actually looking for? Are they actually improving athleticism, and are they actually stacking good days on good days, and that those numbers are from the floor and came back up? Or are you just simply looking at the end goal of like, hey, they aged and they got better?
Yeah.
So there's a natural growth that happens with athletes too, from a younger age to an older age, and they become more skillful in their sport just by doing it. But from a performance side of things, are we tapping this? Are we actually getting the most out of this athlete, or are we just kind of letting them become more skillful? If they become more skillful, well, if we make them more powerful, more robust athletes, that skill could even go up a little bit higher. So what are our metrics that we're measuring, and what are we prioritizing for each athlete that we're programming?
And I would imagine that changes as the athlete evolves and ages up and levels up, so to speak, right?
And I mean there's criteria that we look at across the board, from younger age to older age, for middle school to pro. I mean, there's a lot of metrics that we look at that are the exact same, but for each athlete, may have two athletes that play the exact same position. So a shortstop or two shortstops, but shortstop A may have a lot less power, but a lot more ability to withstand stress over time, so postural integrity. So if he has less power, we may be working on that. But shortstop B may be flipped, and their power is high, but they don't have very much postural integrity. So we may have to program a little bit more on that. And if they're just at the same level, so it's both college kids at D1 programs, and you try to match that athlete up to a program as opposed to the program to the athlete. If they get the same training, they're not going to get the same benefit from the training. So it's whatever their body is presenting to you as is what's going to drive what their program needs.
Yeah, I like to call it, you have to master the micro to produce the macro, right? Like,
Yeah,
everyone wants the results that you see on the TV, but if you don't do those little daily things like you just mentioned, like looking at what we even need to work on in our program, then you're ultimately going to do the athlete a disservice. They're not going to get the results that they're after, or the results that they could be getting. And I also think that in order to produce that long-term repeatability and sustainability, like, you need to be able to adapt to how the athlete presents to you on that given day. Because you
100%.
you threw out different things like energy systems development and postural integrity and that sort of thing that way. Well, one day an athlete might come to me and they might be well rested, and it's time for us to push the envelope on more strength power type metrics. And the next day they might be coming in, exhausted, fatigued, after game, away travel, sleep deprived, whatever it is. And that becomes the time where it's like, look, like, we still have to work on things, but it's almost like sometimes we can do more harm than good. And having the
Yeah,
ability to adjust to how they're presenting that day allows us to, again, further produce that long-term result for them that we're after.
yeah. And you have to think on it as terms as too, is like what does the player actually need? What does the athlete actually need for their sport? So what you can define it as something as far as like, a shortstop needs to be quick and agile, especially lateral side to side. So what are their 5-10-5 numbers? Or in the what's their 60 time? And we all know that, like, the hierarchy of what we think is power or strength numbers drive or foundational to power. Like you have to have the strength to produce power, but strength may become a detriment if they're losing mobility and they're training slow too often. So then their 60 time may actually go down because they just lost mobility and they lost the ability to move fast. So if we're not consistently looking at their 60 time or looking at their 5-10-5 time, we may be missing something because we're just trying to get that athlete stronger. And depending on the time of the season, again, too, depending on the time of the year, if we can, like I talked about earlier, if you train slow in the season and not training a little bit more faster or a little bit more quicker, you may just be limiting the power output that athlete can have.
Yeah, and I think, as we're talking too, I realize a lot of these things might sound like strength and conditioning principles in nature, like power and,
Yeah,
energy systems development and that sort of thing. But in reality, I think these things should be learned by every rehab professional. I don't care if you're an AT, PT, chiro, like the amount of times I see blanket 3x10 flow sheets
right,
still existing in today's day and age, or like the same, 10 shoulder exercises that you could probably get on a Google search being
right.
given to every like pitcher and baseball player that goes into like your general male outpatient ortho clinic. Like it's just infuriating.
Well,
And it's
that's the other thing too, as far as you have to match up what your rehab stuff is to what the player is doing. So if they're back into the return to throw period and you're giving them the same strength exercises, 3x10 that they do every day. First of all, are you truly building strength if they're doing it every day? Because you're not getting any recovery to it. Second of all, are you fatiguing them out for a high exercise, high level, high velocity exercise of if they're long tossing that day and you're doing a strength component and you tell them to do it before your workout? Well, you may have just exhausted the rotator cuff before you actually throw, and then now they're fatigued before they throw, and they go long toss, and they actually cause more damage than what they did. So if you have a heavy strength exercise for the rotator cuff, and then before you throw, you may actually just harm them a little bit. Planning your day out accordingly goes a long way.
Yeah, and there's times in rehab when I actually want to smoke my guys, right? Like
Right.
I did that with two guys earlier today. They left exhausted. They're practically crawling out, and that's the goal of the session for us today was I wanted them to be absolutely smoked. There is a time to do that, but that time is not every session. And
No.
as you mentioned, that need of what we need to do changes over time. But in general, I feel like the rehab profession does a lot of athletes a disservice by grossly underestimating the demands of sport and
Yeah.
overestimating the ability of what basic things that have been used by, everyone from age 3 to age, 100, what they overestimate what those things can do. I wish that basic band IRER cured everything, but
Oh,
it
100%.
doesn't.
It'd be easy then,
Um,
right?
yeah, it would, but that's not the world we live in. So I really think that, from a rehab standpoint, especially if our goal is to transform society by optimizing human movement, for example, we actually have to understand human movement and understand the programming that goes into actually impacting it because 30 IRER band, exercises are not going to do it.
Right. And maybe they need it initially just to create some tension and create some strength in the basic movement, but transitioning that into throwing there's a far transition there. So building strength or being able to create tension in a throw is completely different than it is just creating tension, creating strength with the band.
Even just
So
going back to your basic movement, where you even start in this whole programming process, where you start in the periodization process, Nate, like starting at that movement base, like there's areas of the body that need to be mobile and stable, right? Like I think
yeah,
everyone can picture that diagram in their heads right now that has like mobility here, stability here, as I say that. And it's like, plain and simple, if you don't have stability of like, hey, the scapula, for example, and you're just trying to beef up, the shoulder, as in like the humerus and the rotator cuff, but the shoulder blade itself isn't stable, to use the line from Eric DeGatti, you're trying to fire a cannon from a canoe. Like,
Yeah.
it's not going to go well. So,
What's interesting too is a lot of times, obviously, I look at shoulder strength for all my baseball guys, especially when I'm in when they're injured, to see if they're okay. One of the biggest factors is, like, well, I see this time and time and again, they may have limited shoulder strength, but really what fixes it is either improving their thorax rotation just so they can create that stable scapula, or improving neck range of motion or cervical range of motion and stability to create that full input to the rotator cuff so that it knows to actually fire when it needs to. And then their strength comes back without even working on strength, which is a huge missing point if you just see the strength but don't look at basic human movement. That you're not going to actually you're going to miss something. You're going to think that it's a strength issue, but it's truly just a neurological, like, say neurological, but neuro input issue. The
yeah.
rotator cuff just can't fire at the right time.
You mentioned the neural input issue, and earlier you mentioned about the fatigability of, session timing as it relates to sport. And this whole course that you developed is about periodization. I know a lot of guys do their little arm care routines. I see a lot of guys with bands before they step on the baseball field. Should that be periodized as well? Is it okay for, like, your quote unquote arm care routine to be the exact same thing day in and day out, or should that be something that's adapted and evolved over time as well?
No, it definitely adapted and evolved over time, especially weekly. So, like, I touched on a little bit before, was that's one of the, especially, well, we were talking about a little bit with rehab, but from a guy standpoint, when I train somebody, I will essentially program their entire day out. So from throwing volume to arm care to training in the weight room, so that everything matches up how where I would say it should. So arm care stuff, local arm care. If you want to develop a robust arm for one, to restore motion after throwing and recovery, and then two, also, so basically recovery and for performance, you're gonna have to have different arm care exercises and strength, quote unquote, strength exercises for different days. So if I'm gonna throw heavy, if I'm gonna throw off the mound tomorrow, I'm not gonna want to fatigue out the rotator cuff today by building up strength, because I'm not going to be recovered by the time I step foot on the mound. So if I'm programming for a pitcher that's throwing tomorrow, I'm probably going to have him do a lot of isometric strength the day before, mainly for rotator cuff. This is rotator cuff period, or shoulder, because that rotator cuff is one. It can create a little bit of strength in the angle that you're at, but it's non-fatiguing. So there's no carryover the next day, but you're still getting end range isometric contraction. You're getting the muscle ready to fire, getting it prepared for the next day, activating it. And then that day after you throw, that was a high velocity throwing. So they just did a whole lot of high velocity movement. So for recovery's sake, and you can even say this is for a little bit of performance as well, you may want to do a lot of eccentric work after they throw, specific to the shoulder, because in that movement, in that eccentric control of that shoulder, you're really getting rid of those trigger points in there, kind of like they relax a little bit, because you're getting so much neural input, so much control from the shoulder going through the similar movements of throwing at a high velocity, but you're getting it at a much slower velocity. So that may be what you want to do that day. And then if you're multiple days out from throwing, say two or more, and you just didn't have a hard throwing day, that would probably be where I would say is a good time to fully develop strength, like an actual strength component to your shoulder, because you still need it strong. You still need to be able to create tension, but you want to make sure that you're not fatigued before you step on the foot on the mound again. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the pitcher's job is to pitch. It's not necessarily just to be strong in their sport. Now, strength may help it out, but we're not gonna set any records or try to be the best person on earth with shoulder ERIRs.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, to your point on strength, like, the yellow band isn't going to cut it, but
Yeah,
I think that it's one thing to be strong, it's another thing to have that strength mean something. Going back through everything you just outlined, though, first off, I love your point on the ISOs. I definitely think these are something we're starting to see take off a lot more and more
hmm
in the sports setting. And some people talk about it from an activation standpoint. I think the blood flow and circulation standpoint's really strong here.
yeah,
I also see a lot of value from the tendon loading piece here as well. Is, think about sport like baseball, the amount of force we're going through the shoulder when we throw the ball, like that's a lot through some very small tendons.
yeah,
So if I can put a little bit of load through them in order to help prep them for something very high velocity and high force, then I certainly want to do that. And, does it make a benefit on performance? I'll argue that it does, but I think the bigger thing is long-term health and sustainability. Like guys, I want them throwing for their entire career. I don't want them getting like shoulder surgeries and that sort of thing
yeah.
because we didn't take care of this. That's why we call it arm care in the first place. So I love the point on ISOs. I love that you can, vary the angle, the position, and really like you can take them anywhere, right? Like you literally just
Y-
need a wall. And I think everyone's got one of those in the dugout, or if you're traveling in the hotel, right? Like you can literally take these wherever with no equipment. So I think that
Or you
they're
can use
very
the
powerful for that reason. And I love your point on eccentrics. And this is another thing too that, again, like from a portability standpoint, like get a buddy, work together on some partner eccentrics. It's probably going to
yeah,
take you a few times to get used to like manual resisted stuff, but once you get the hang of it, you should be good to go. And no equipment,
100%.
easy to travel, and you can load these up to again help with that more slow type of contraction as opposed to the quicker speed of throwing that you
Yeah,
mentioned before. So I really like the way you outlined it, but again, these things don't have to be complicated. It's not like you need access to a full gym on the road to really like nail these things down. Is you can really make a lot from a little here.
yeah, for sure. Most of it, most baseball players, most teams have bands that they travel with. Like you said, you can use the wall, you can use the ground for ISOs. It doesn't even take, or you can use, shoot, you can use your partner, you can use your throwing partner. They can just stand there and you can push up against them. It doesn't take much to be able to do some of this stuff, do some of that stuff with it. So it can be taken anywhere.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I know we didn't get into it a ton today so far, but I know you're a big proponent of regional interdependence and how everything comes together that way. And I think that understanding that throwing is a lot more than just the arm, even though we always like to focus on the arm, and I'm guilty of that myself. There's a lot more to it than just that, and understanding, how we prep and program for the core, the hip, all these other areas as well are also going to have an impact on what we see on the
Yeah,
field.
right. And that again, that's person dependent on what it is. When I start working with somebody, whether it's training or performance training, or if it's rehab in the rehab specific, I typically tell them, especially for rehab specific, and they have a shoulder issue. Obviously, I'm going to work really close on the shoulder, correcting any mobility deficits or anything there initially, because that's probably what's going to make them feel better quicker. But what was the root cause of that? And I kind of warn them a little bit on, because I'll get them into a good arm care routine, a local arm care, strengthening, creating tension through there too. And I usually tell them it's a little bit two part that I work on. Half the session, I might not even, like, we might be working on your ankle for your arm, but then we'll also make sure that you'll be able to create the tension for your arm as well. Um, so there's multiple pieces to the puzzle, and you just have to make sure you're hitting all of them. But then your testing is what's guiding you. Your systems in place is making sure that you don't veer off of what they may or may not need.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we've talked about the system, the programming piece. We've talked about it in relation to the exercise component for coaches, strength coaches, PT, AT, rehab, that sort of thing. Where do you think, a little separate from program design, or maybe I'll lump it in with it, where does something like a manual therapy or like a modality, like a feel good type of thing, like a foam roller, a massage gun, where does that stuff fit into the program, right? Does that have a time and a place? Or is that
Yeah,
something that it's like, we should just neglect that stuff because maybe it doesn't do what we thought it does? Where does like the manual and the like TLC work fit into all this?
I think they're all. I mean, honestly, I think they're all great things for two different reasons. One, um, you have a hard time changing movement. You have a hard time fixing a problem if it's a rehab setting in the presence of pain. So one, you have to get rid of the literal chemical issue. If it's a chemical or a inflammatory issue, you have to get rid of that first. So that's where your manual can come in. Edema massage, stuff like that. If there's actually true inflammation, if it's a mechanical issue, what what's what's creating that mechanical issue? That's where say there's a mobility restriction in the hip leading to say they can't flex their hips, so they're gonna create a little bit of valgus maybe when they go into it, and then that's creating some patellofemoral pain. So improving the flexion of the hip may change their alignment for when they go into a squat and change that patellofemoral pain. So manual stuff to improve the hip mobility is key. Same things, and that can change into a performance side of stuff too. If they don't have enough hip flexion to go into a squat, doing a little bit of manual stuff, pre stuff, or some band mobs to improve mobility there, so they can actually sit into their hips to squat is going to be able to access get into a better posture, get into a better pattern to fully get the full best benefit of your exercise. And then the recovery aspects, your NMES, your TINs, all that stuff, drive blood flow, all the science behind it is good, to a degree, but there's also kind of like you said, the TLC. There's a huge psychological component, too, with athletes. So, and I make sure I tell athletes this on the front end. If you identify the problem as your front hip can't internally rotate, so your shoulders making up the mobility deficit, and you're having shoulder pain because of that, and you have an athlete that doesn't know the body as well as what we have, and they don't have the studies on that, and you don't ever touch the shoulder from a rehab standpoint, buy-in for what you're doing is going to be very low. They're going to ask a whole lot of questions. Well, some of them will ask a whole lot of questions, and then those are the ones that you can typically explain, and they'll understand why you're doing what you're doing. But some of them won't ask questions. They'll just be like, that guy didn't even touch my shoulder, and that's the pain. That's where it hurts. And he's already in his mind already just thought he just brushed you aside already because he's like, oh, he's not addressing my problem, even though you identified the true case of the problem. So using those NMES manual stuff on a shoulder, even if it's just as a feel good, well, you just helped out that athlete to saying, hey, I am addressing your main concern, but I'm also hitting something that you didn't know was a concern as well. So it kind of creates a buy-in. It kind of creates a trust aspect to the athlete as well, knowing that you're working on that specific spot.
Yeah, I love that. And that's an essential piece is I feel like the mental component to rehab, injury management, and even not just like in the presence of injury, but even just like in general training, the trust piece is extremely essential and cannot be overlooked. And to your point too on the NMES, we just recently talked about this on the podcast in relation to the ankle. But plain and simple, we often think about it in relation to like the quad following ACL surgery, right? Like it's so easy
Yep.
to just take to take NMES and slap it on the quad, no big deal. But we can slap it on rotator cuff muscles as well, right? We could slap
Yep.
it on like scapular stabilizers as well. Just because it's easy to use on the quad doesn't mean we can't use it elsewhere. And
Right.
it's pretty easy to use elsewhere too. And again, if you want to make someone feel good, some low level electric current to fire up certain muscles, we'll take that any day. Now,
Right.
likewise, you can just use that to make someone feel awful. Just crank it up all the way and, stick it on them for 30, 40 minutes. They won't feel great, but it's the tool is there and it can be used in a beneficial means. It's just a matter of, are you going to use it that way or are you going to abuse it?
Yeah, 100%. You just have to figure out, you have to see what your intent is about for it. If your intent is essentially, and where do you lie? Are you using NMES way down the line when they already have quad activation for an ACL, and you're just using it just because you have for the past 10 visits? Then is that truly beneficial to the client, or is that just because you got stuck in your ways?
Yeah,
So
exactly. But, thankfully, I've not met anyone who's stuck in their ways still using ultrasound. And if they are, I hope they stop very soon.
you haven't been around enough then.
You're right about that. Nate, I feel like we could probably talk about stuff like this all day long. But, for people who want to find out more about this concept of program design, how they can better, provide for their athletes, or maybe they're an athlete who wants to learn more about what their programming should look like, where can they find your program design course at?
Yeah, you can just find it on my website, integratedperformanceteam.com. And there's a little spot up top on the if you look at the top right, it'll have periodization for program design as a link to it. And they can just get it straight from there.
And I still can't believe this. It is literally only $8.
$7.99.
Yeah, dude, my coffee this morning cost more than that.
It's hey, that's all I need. That they can have it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So great quality content, all about program design, periodization for program design, all for like literally $8. I mean, I'm signing up myself. So we'll link to that in the description below. That way, if you want to check that out, you can do so there. And Nate, I know you keep a booming social media presence as well. Where can they find you on like Instagram and that sort of thing?
Yeah, Instagram's just integrated performance. And then Facebook's the integrated performance, and then dash sports physical therapy and performance training. And then Twitter is Nate Denning. I believe there's an underscore in between Nate and Denning. Nate underscore Denning. And then
Awesome.
Instagram is integrated performance.
Perfect. We'll link to all that in the description below as well. Nate, it's always a pleasure, man. Thanks for your time,
Yeah,
dude.
Dan. Always love being on this show. Thanks for having me again.